This is my CAA Historical Timeline over ESL programs and bilingual education. This historical timeline consists of 10 major events that have had an impact on the education of English language learner students. The timeline begins with the court case of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. After this was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The next year, in 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act passed. Following this was the Bilingual Education Act of 1968. Next, the CERN Reverse Portales Municipal Schools court case in 1974. Another major case of 1974 was the Lau v. Nichols court case. Additionally, the Equal Education Opportunities Act passed in 1974. Following this was the court case Castaneda v. Picard in 1981. A few years later, the No Child Left Behind Act was passed in 2002 and was implemented in schools till 2016. Lastly, the Every Student Succeeds Act was passed in 2015 and is seen in schools still today. The court case Brown v. Board of Education is the first historical event on this timeline. This case occurred in 1954 and outlawed separate but equal public schools. In other words, this put an end to segregated schools because they were inconsistent with the idea of equal education. Although Hispanics and other minorities were not mentioned specifically, the ruling also applied to those in a similar situation to the one directly represented. This court case acted as a stepping stone for the future claims against discrimination in schooling. Specifically, this case made the parents of English language learners begin to view the schooling of their children as possibly discriminatory. Brown v. Board of Education was the start to a new era in American civil rights and led to the creation of more programs for the disadvantaged. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the next major event that impacted bilingual education. This act prohibited discrimination against any race, color, or national origin in any programs that received federal aid. This was very important for educational institutions because many of them relied heavily on federal assistance. This act provided minority students with the same access as non-minority students in their schooling. This act is very well known for the impact it had on education for English language learners. Although the impact was not direct, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a gateway that opened the door for change regarding bilingual education in the United States. In turn, this improved the education of English language learners now and in the future. In response to the emphasis placed on equality in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 was enacted and is the next event on our timeline. This act was a part of President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty. It resulted in the expansion of state departments of education and provided a greater role for states to make education policy. The act was meant to provide equal access to quality education for all students and provided funding for primary and secondary education. A big focus of this act was maintaining high standards and accountability in the schools. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 focused more on students from low-income families. However, it still improved the education of English language learner students. In 1968, the Bilingual Education Act became law. This law passed as an amendment to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. This law was the federal government's first commitment to helping students with limited English proficiency skills. It was recognized that these students have special educational needs, and to uphold equal educational opportunity, bilingual programs that would address those needs must be federally funded. Additionally, resources such as training teachers and aides, developing and disseminating instructional materials, and encouraging parental involvement were provided to support these educational programs. The Bilingual Education Act of 1968 started to formally recognize that students of ethnic minorities could receive differentiated services for reasons other than violating their civil rights. Instruction in a language other than English was being encouraged, and cultural awareness was beginning to grow. The education of English language learners is improving. A few years later, in 1974, the CERN Reverse Municipal Schools court case arose. This case raised the issue of bilingual education outside the context of desegregation. This case held the school district responsible for ensuring equal protection for their students regardless of surname. Furthermore, this created more equal educational opportunities by setting up bilingual and bicultural programs in the school. Schools also had to begin making sure that teachers were eligible and qualified to teach their English language learner students. The CERN Reverse Municipal Schools court case protected English language learner students from being discriminated against under equal protection and provided them more accessible education that could foster success. In 1974, the court case Lau v. Nichols was underway. The Supreme Court overruled lower courts and argued that the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum does not constitute equal education. This case recognized that if a student knew little to no English, they were not receiving any meaningful education through English-only instruction. This case outlawed the sink-or-swim educational method. This court case was a major improvement to the education of English language learner students. Students who did not know English were now provided special assistance so that they were taught equally. This case stopped just short of mandating bilingual education because it was still allowing flexibility among districts to use alternative teaching methods. In the same year as the Lau v. Nichols court case, the Equal Education Opportunity Act of 1974 passed. This act specifically stated that language barriers must be overcome by instructional programs. This extended the Lau ruling to all students and school districts, not just those receiving federal funds. Furthermore, this act also prohibits discrimination against faculty, staff, and students, including racial segregation of students. The Equal Education Opportunity Act of 1974 was great for the education of English language learner students and bilingual education programs. This required all school districts, regardless of federal funding, to provide equal education for their students and overcome language barriers by providing the programs necessary to achieve this. The court case Castaneda v. Picard of 1981 is the next event on our timeline. This court case was filed because a parent believed that the way his children were being taught was segregated by their use of a grouping system for classrooms based on ethnically and racially discriminating criteria. While the district court ruling was against the Castanedas, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit ruled in favor of them. This led to the creation of a three-part assessment that determined how bilingual education programs would be held responsible for meeting the requirements of the Equal Educational Opportunity Act of 1974. The criteria are that bilingual education programs must be based on sound educational theory. The program must be implemented effectively with resources for personnel, instructional materials, and space, and after a trial period, the program must be proven effective in overcoming language barriers and handicaps. This court case ensured that there is a standard for school districts to be held accountable to when educating their English language learner students. In 2002, the No Child Left Behind Act was put into place. The Elementary Secondary Education Act was reauthorized by President George W. Bush and created the No Child Left Behind Act. This removed bilingual and used the term limited English proficient. Doing this depicted these students as having a deficit. No Child Left Behind neither encouraged nor restricted bilingual programs. There was a heavy emphasis on high-stakes testing, and English language learners were required to participate in the state-mandated tests regardless of English proficiency or how long they'd been in the country. Every year, states had to establish English language proficiency standards and annual English language proficiency tests for their English language learner students. Every year, schools were expected to see an increase in the percentage of English language learners making progress in learning English, attaining English proficiency, and passing state English language arts and math tests. Although the No Child Left Behind Act was able to bring to attention some of the needs of English language learners, ultimately it led to Teach to the Test, which was inappropriate for English language learners and discouraged bilingual programs in the school. The last event on our historical timeline is the Every Student Succeeds Act from 2015 to present day. In 2015, the Elementary Secondary Education Act was reauthorized as the Every Student Succeeds Act. President Obama signed this into law. This act maintained standards and testing requirements from the No Child Left Behind Act, but allowed states more flexibility in establishing school accountability programs. The full implementation of this act began in the 2018 and 2019 school year. The Every Student Succeeds Act was a big improvement over the No Child Left Behind Act and gives states the opportunity to create flexible and reasonable expectations for their English language learner students. In the coming years, there will be more information on how effective and impactful these policies are on the education of English language learner students.